Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully we can get going here. We have about 20 minutes to go through a topic that last year I think I spent about maybe 75 minutes going through. So we'll do our best to get through the content here, talking about the process that we have to be able to help you migrate on-prem Dynamics customer engagement or CRM instances or orgs into our online environment. Just as a quick introduction, my name is Marty Carreras. I'm a principal solution architecture manager within our Dynamics 365 FastTrack team. I'm one of the managers that oversees teams of people that work with customers that are part of our FastTrack program, one of which are things that we do, which is to help customers migrate their on-prem instances into online. But we also do a lot of other solution architect advisory type activities as well. My role in the organization is really focused mostly on our US public sector customers. So I deal with our GCC or GCC high environment, which is a geo that is specific to our US state and local customers as well as federal government. But everything I'm going to talk about here not only applies to that environment, of course, but also all of the geographies we have around the world. So no matter where you're coming from, no matter where you are, the geo that is of interest to you, we have the ability to migrate your orgs from on-prem into online. Before we get started here, you also see a name, Jason Kim. Jason wasn't able to join us, but he's my manager who runs the overall global team that does a lot of the things that we all do geographically aligned throughout the world. So before we get too deep into this, just by a show of hands, how many have tried to do a migration from on-prem to online manually, doing data migration? Has anybody attempted to do that? Got one person in the back? All right. As a show of hands, how many today are on-prem in 2011? 13? 13? 15? Any 15s out there? 16? Got 16s? All right. Anybody go up to V9 yet? Okay. So we got a good kind of collection of source databases that you'll be coming from and source organizations. The good news of what I'm going to tell you about today is that no matter what version you're on today, we're able to take that version and bring it up into the cloud environment and turn that on-premise instance into an online software as a service or on-prem org into an online instance. And what we're going to go through is kind of just describe at a high level how that whole process works, how our team engages with your team to use a tool to facilitate this, and really do legitimately a lift and shift of your database. So what we're not going to be doing is trying to manually migrate your data in terms of record by record migration. We're literally taking the database back up and moving it into the online environment. And that's a very important distinction because that is the only way to be able to get all of your customizations and configurations, all of your data, all of your audit information, and a lot of the other information related to created by and other data that becomes very difficult to do if you're trying to do a manual migration. So this is all about lifting and shifting from on-prem into online. Last year when we were here, we had some constraints. We weren't able to take databases that were in SQL 2012, or 2016, it had to be 2012. We don't have those restrictions anymore. And the reason for that is because we're actually taking whatever version you're in today, whether it be 2011, 13, 15, 16, or 9, when it comes online, it's 9.1. So it's running in Azure SQL, it's running on our Azure backbone, and it's the latest and greatest version. So let's talk about how we do that. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to say is, if you're curious about timing and how long it takes, obviously it depends on how big the database is, but just to give you a bit of a context, just recently we migrated a very large customers organization that was about 1.7 terabytes from 2015 and brought it online to version 9.1. And the duration of that from going from shutting down on Friday to having it live again was about 10 actual hours. So that they brought it down Friday night at about 8 p.m., did their backup, and went through the process I'm going to talk about here, and it came up online in version 9.1 in about 10-hour period, which is a pretty substantial feat for a database of that size to get from one on-prem environment into our online instance. Of course, you could take that and think about an org that's 10 gigabytes. It takes orders of magnitude less time to do that. It could be several hours, just a couple hours. Certainly, it's going to involve downtime. It has to, right? We were taking it back up and moving it online. But that's just to give you a bit of an idea. All right, so how do we do this? What is the kind of the overall process here? Well, go get and create a whole bunch of these upgraded environments. Our tool does that using your Azure subscription. And by doing that, it maintains and ensures that you maintain control of your database throughout the entire lifecycle because it's in your subscription from cradle to grave, right? The other important part is the mapping. Pointer doesn't work, but the mapping process here. The user IDs that you're using usually in an on-premise environment are going to be your Active Directory domain / the username, right? Well, in the online world, it's an email address essentially. So there's a process there where we have to work with you to make sure you have all your users mapped from source to destination. It's a simple data file that gets created, and that also is part of what happens as we migrate this from on-prem to online, so that the underlying GUIDs in the system all remain the same. All the relationships of ownership and all of that is all that integrity is maintained. All we really do is change the username. And by changing the username and tying it to an Azure Active Directory GUID, that allows people to then log in, right? But from an end user perspective, they have one user ID that they use on Friday, and then they have a new user ID that they use on Monday. And if you're using single sign-on, they probably don't even know the difference. It'll just pass through, and they'll log in, and they'll have access to their org. So if we dive in a little bit deeper about how this all kind of plays out, I talked about a tool that we have to facilitate that. And the tool is called Lifecycle Services. If any of you are familiar with our finance and operations product of Dynamics, you might be familiar with Lifecycle Services and what it does. If you're not, think of it really as an orchestration engine, right? It's an orchestrator that is able to have a secure connection to your Azure subscription, to use your Azure subscription to spin up resources that it needs. Specifically, it spins up a set of VMs, a SQL Server VM, a CRM VM, and an Active Directory. And it does that. It creates sets of these VMs for each of the versions that we have to cycle through to get you from your source database all the way up to V9. And then it also communicates with our online services platform to ultimately take the final backup from V9 and migrate that over to our online environment, and then essentially bring it up as a new sandbox instance inside your tenant. So Lifecycle Services is what is doing all of the work there. And if I could show you, just to give you a visual of that, let me just bounce over and give you a sense of what that looks like. Here's a sample project that we have here. And what you can see is it's got multiple stages to it. So stages 1, 2, 3, and 4, and each of these stages have many different steps. And this process is what we will be working and coaching you through in terms of everything that needs to happen. We collect information about your tenant. What tenant is this going to go into? We create a secure cert so that we can, that cert gets uploaded into your Azure subscription, so that Lifecycle Services is then able to talk to your Azure subscription securely and be able to spin up the resources it needs to be able to go through the upgrade process. And we also collect some information about an Azure Blob Storage account, because ultimately that's what gets used for you to provide your backup file, and where the backup file is ultimately produced that ends up coming across into the online environment. So there's a bunch of setup information that happens. We do some initial provisioning. Ultimately, we get over to a step here where we spin up all the different VMs and start the upgrade process. And within each of these steps, there's a number of different sub-steps that happen. But just imagine that really what it's doing is it's spinning up a VM, it's importing the database into the SQL Server, it's then importing that in through Deployment Manager, it's importing that CRM database to the latest version, which of course does the upgrade. Then it takes a backup, moves it on to the next set of VMs, and just cycles that all the way through, right? And again, all of that is automated. Once you set up the configurations that we need to be able to have that secure connection to your Azure subscription, it automates that whole sequence of events. So if you're coming from 2011, you supply a backup file and a user mapping file, and it's literally going to take it from 2011 to 13, 15, 16, 9, and then upgrade it, or move it over to online. Now, that's the process, right? Certainly, the devil's in the detail in terms of what all needs to happen to kind of make this all really work. And a couple things to keep in mind is that, if you're dealing with a database that's been on-prem, you may have bent the rules a little bit. Maybe you didn't follow all the best practices through the years. Maybe somebody got in there and they're a schema owner because of the way that they're dealing with, you might be dealing with some reporting. Maybe somebody created a store procedure that perhaps they probably shouldn't have done, but maybe they did to kind of, get some things done. Those kinds of things our tool will detect and present as errors, right? Those are things that will give that feedback and say, we can't bring this online until you clean up these particular issues. And that's okay, right? We expect that. So the idea here is that, as I said in the beginning, we're going to cycle through this process a number of times. The best way to know how much work you're going to have is to just try it, right? That first time through, we're going to know we got a super clean database and a super clean process where everything is just going to work. That's nice. Sometimes that's not the case, and there may be some schema owners we got to get rid of. There might be some store procedures we might detect, and we're going to have to work with you to say you got to go in and change that in the source so that we can get through the rest of the migration. Okay, now that can either be done in your source database, or sometimes what happens is there might be a cleanup activity that needs to happen as part of the migration cycle. So we might go through this and discover, all right, look, we can't get the production database up until online until these things happen. But at the same time, you don't want to make those changes to your production environment because you have people that are actually using the system every day, right? So for every one of those VM environments, because they're inside your Azure subscription, you have access to go into them. So through the tooling, if there's a spot where we say, okay, before we actually take this online, we need you to go into the VM and go change something in the database so that we can actually take a clean backup and move it online. You have the ability through that lifecycle tool that I just showed you to actually get into the VM. And it's just a matter of remoting into it. The other thing that we do, because we're dealing with VMs inside your subscription, we're very cognizant of costs, right? So these VMs, when you have a whole bunch of them, could add up if we just leave them turned on. So the tool's smart enough to know I got to spin up a VM, do what I need to do, get my backup, turn it off, spin up the next set, turn it off. Again, all those things are automated. Okay. If we look at an example, kind of to reiterate what I'm saying here, this is a scenario where someone's coming from 2015. So the first thing they do is take a backup from their on-prem database. They upload that to the storage account. That's going to get staged inside the CRM 2015 VM. It's going to upgrade it to 2016. It's going to upgrade it to 9. It's going to validate and map all of the users through the user mapping file that you would provide, and ultimately it's going to migrate it. Okay? And if you're starting at 2011, it just extends that cycle. All right. A couple considerations and some prerequisites I want to make sure we're clear about. Again, we can take any version from 2011 onwards. We can take any SQL database version that you're on, which is good news. You're going to need a destination tenant, believe it or not. So in order to be able to migrate your database up there, there has to be a sandbox environment available. Now, if you're familiar with our online environment, if you've got let's say that you've subscribed to 3 sandboxes, but you only have 2 of them provisioned, it means you have a sandbox that's sitting there and ready to configure on your instance administration screen. That's what we need. Because what happens is this process creates a sandbox and then imports your instance, your org database into that sandbox. So there has to be a sandbox slot available in your tenant. So from a licensing perspective, that's an important consideration. We actually need the resources there. Same thing with the users. The users need to be licensed because when the org migrates online, what we then will do is flow all those users actually we'll link all the existing users that are licensed based on the mapping file into that instance so that they can actually log in. And as you know with online instances, you need a license to log in. So of course you have to have licenses. I keep talking about your Azure subscription, and that's very important for us to be able for you to trust that you have control of your data throughout this process. So all of it is within your Azure subscription. So certainly you need an Azure subscription to be able to facilitate the upgrade and migration process. There are a little bit of exceptions to that. If there's a situation where you already have a V9 database and you literally just want us to take a backup and move it up, we might be able to get away with just using an Azure storage account. So if you're in that kind of a scenario, we can support that too. It's a little bit of a slight variation to the way we can do it, but ultimately we need a backup file that's at version 9. So if you have a version 9 backup file there, we can work with that as well. All right. A few considerations I want to make sure we point out. Oop. As I move ahead here. I can stay at this slide. You may have heard by now that the web client, as opposed to the unified client interface, has been officially deprecated, right? So we need to move to the unified interface. If you think about it, if you're in 2015, 13, 16, whatever, you're still using the web client, right? So one of the things that customers are often doing when they have a migration project like this is part of their post-migration steps is to apply a solution that represents the functionality that they ultimately want their end users to start using. So as an example, you want to get to unified interface as quickly as possible here because time's running out. So you may say, all right, we're going to shut down on Friday with version 2015, and we're going to come up on Monday with version 9.1 in the unified interface. And the way that you do that is that we would go through the migration. After the migration's done, during that weekend deployment time frame, you apply a solution and make sure that the unified interface is looking the way it needs to look based on all the testing and all the iterations we would have done up until that point. So by the time the users come in on Monday, they have a brand new unified interface with version 9.1. And that's something really important to consider in the planning on doing this. You could just go ahead and move it and bring them up in 9.1 in the web client and deal with the unified interface upgrade later. But it may be worth considering to just go ahead and knock all that out at the same time because there's not a lot of time left between now and the fall to get that transition done. So if you're going to experience some downtime, you're going to go through some training anyway with your users, we highly suggest you think about incorporating a unified interface transition at the same time. Okay? I said this before and I'll say it many, many times here. Dry runs are expected, encouraged, and are realistically what we end up doing. So we'll do this multiple times. I want to make sure I leave that very, very clear that this is not a once and done thing, but we expect to work over a multi-week period of time to get this done with you. So this session really is only 20 minutes. I'm going to be at the booth for the rest of the day here. I can certainly take some questions now if you have them, while we have some time for our next presenter to come up. So with that, let me open it up. Does this seem to make sense? Okay. We've done thousands of these for what it's worth. All right, so I'm gonna, I'll stay up here if anybody wants to come up and ask me any other questions. Otherwise, find me at the Dynamics 365 customer engagement booth over there, and we can talk through logistics of how you can get this done. Good luck, everybody.